Well, good morning, everyone. Bert Farias again with our School of Prayer. This is episode number 24. Episode number 23 was a 10-minute audio session of Phil Halverson, a man that's with the Lord now, a great prayer, a great intercessor. I put up a sample of Dad Hagin calling Brother Halverson to the pulpit to pray. And so I thought that would that would bless some of you who are real hungry to pray in deeper places, as Phil Halverson was such an example of praying in those deep realms with God. And I'm all for demonstration. We learn by precept and example. Most people don't learn just by hearing about prayer, but by observing people praying and just the demonstration of what it means to pray in the Spirit. That's how people learn the quickest. Today, I want to talk about praying down the power of God. I want to equate prayer again with power. The Bible says in James chapter 5, verse 16, that the fervent, effectual prayer of a righteous man avails much. One translation says it makes tremendous power available that is dynamic in its working. And so I want to talk about this dynamic power and how it manifests. And eventually, if we have time today or the next episode, I want to talk about how to obtain the spirit of prayer, that you can release God's power in greater measures. You know, I'm a student of revival. I have studied past revivals from the book of Acts on through history, through the Azusa Street revival, the Wales revival. Even farther back, I believe one of the greatest revivals was in 1830 and 31 through one Charles Finney, one of the greatest American evangelists, revivalists in recent history. He had he partnered with two men of prayer named Father Nash, Daniel Nash, and Abel Clary. We have referred to these two men in past episodes, but today I want to read you an account of that 1830-31 revival in Rochester, New York. I'm reading from this book, Cleansing the Temple. There's 4 sections in this book. The last section is on prayer, becoming a house of prayer. And I'm gonna start reading. I'm gonna read quite a bit today. Some of the greatest revivals in American history manifested through the ministry of Charles G. Finney. We've made mention of him earlier in this book and quoted him in the last chapter. But as we near the end of the book, I want to share a remarkable example of the real spirit of prayer that was at work. See, the spirit of prayer is what we need to obtain to be able to give birth and to be able to release this kind of power that we're going to read about this morning. Not only in life, but in the lives of not only in Finney's life, but in the lives of 2 other prominent men of deep prayer who were the backbone and fuel of most of Finney's revivals. And again, their names were Daniel Nash and Abel Clary. Here's an excerpt from a book about the life of Daniel Nash and the mention of a few others like him who obtained the spirit of prayer. Okay, the most remarkable revival of this period in American history was that which occurred in Rochester, New York in 1830-31. Rochester was a young city, wrote Finney, full of thrift and enterprise and full of sin. Nash and Cleary were well aware of this as they teamed up for the praying with the assistance of others. As we have noted, these 2 men were so similar in their praying that one is often described to explain the other. Such fervent praying and agony of soul brought sights that may seem strange to our eyes today. Our gentle prayers accomplish so little, but then they cost us so little. Finney wrote, I have never known a person to sweat blood, but I have known a person pray till the blood started from his nose. And I have known persons pray till they were all wet with perspiration in the coldest weather in winter. I have known persons pray for hours until their strength was all exhausted with the agony of their minds. Such prayers prevailed with God. This agony in prayer was prevalent in Jonathan Edwards' day in the revivals which then took place. This is going back into the 1700s with Jonathan Edwards. But during the Rochester meetings, there are several accounts of these two men in deep agony of soul while praying day and night. Some accounts name Nash, some name Clary, others name both. It seems they were together in fasting and prayer, much of the time weeping and crying out to God. Sometimes they lay prostrate without strength to stand up. Their concern over sinners being lost brought great stress to their minds and their hearts. They groaned under this load, they risked their health, and they gave up comforts that a battle of the heavenliest might be won. Sometimes they would writhe and groan in agony over souls. God honored their burden bearing and poured out his Spirit. The spirit of prayer was so poured out so powerfully that some people stayed away from the services to pray, being unable to restrain their feelings under the preaching. Privately they prayed, and publicly God answered. The results of this awakening were incredible. One of the first results was the coming together of the different churches, which constituted a large breakthrough in those days, as it would now. As the awakening swept through the town, the great mass of the influential people, both male and female, were convicted and converted. It seems almost impossible to believe, but it began with the judges, the lawyers, the physicians, the bankers, and the merchants, and worked its way down to the bottom of society till nearly everybody had joined one or other of the churches. Consequently, the public affairs of the city were put to a large extent into the hands of Christian men. Because the awakening was so powerful and gathered in such great numbers of people, especially the most influential people, it created great excitement. Like the Welsh awakening in 1904 to 1906, many people came in from near and far to witness the great work of God and were converted. The New York evangelist, that is Charles Finney, reported that almost every town, listen to this, almost every town within 40 to 50 miles of Rochester is favored with the special presence of the Lord. Finney preached in as many places as he had time and strength to do, asserting that the work spread like waves in every direction. Wherever he preached, he was astounded that in every instance the Lord has come and commenced the work upon the spot. Finney was only too well aware of the opposition of the evil one and how that had to be dealt with first. Therefore, he knew that a huge breakthrough had been made in the heavenlies, so that the Lord was free to come down and do his work. Years later, Dr. Beecher, the renowned preacher of Boston, remarked that the 1830-31 Rochester revival was the greatest work of God and the greatest revival of religion that the world has ever seen in a short time. Wow. 100,000 people were reported as having joined themselves to churches as a result of the awakening. This, he said, is unparalleled in the history of the church. Moreover, these were not shallow conversions, but genuine works of God, for the most ungodly sinners had been convicted of sin. So manifestly were the great mass of the conversions sound. The sinners really regenerated and made new creatures. So profoundly were individuals and whole communities reformed, and so permanent and unquestionable were the results, that almost universally it was acknowledged that this was the work of God. There were so many instances of conversion that was so striking, such characters converted in all classes, both high and low, rich and poor, so thoroughly subdued by the Spirit as to silence all opposition. The proof of all this was seen in the effects on society. The only theater in the city was converted into a livery stable. The circus was converted into a soap and candle factory. The bars and taverns closed down. But in the realm of crime, this is where the most astounding results were seen. The most full and careful census of crime in that city, both before and after the awakening, was taken by the most competent men, including the prosecuting attorney for the city. Now listen to this. The census showed that during the period from 1830, when the revival started, until 1842, 12 years, the number of prosecutions of crime decreased less than a third of the number prior to the revival. That is amazing enough, but what is astounding is that this took place during a period when the population of the city increased threefold. The population of the city in 1830 was just over 10,000. Then in 1842, it was 32,000. So in 12 years, the population tripled. If the prosecutions in 1829 were about 300, that is 3%, this means the prosecutions in 1842 were less than 100, which would be a prosecution rate of only 0.3%. So again, crime decreased greatly because of the influence of the presence of God in the city of Rochester, New York. That Rochester, even today, is one of the most charitable philanthropic, however you say it, cities of philanthropy in the nation. This means that the awareness of the presence of a holy God was so strong and so powerful that it continued for years afterwards, so that all the new people who were coming into the town, who would have included many different kinds of characters, including violent criminals, were so subdued by the manifest presence of God that almost no crimes were committed. Nothing like this has been seen in the history of the world. That is just amazing. All because of men that knew how to pray down the power, give birth to the power in the conversion of souls, that it changed an entire city, that even 40 to 50 miles away, that presence was felt. All this was due to a few people, not everybody, not a big crowd, a few people, including Daniel Nash, really praying, with one man, Finney, preaching. Within a few months, Daniel was dead, Daniel Nash. And by the way, when he died, Finney left the evangelistic ministry because he knew without men of prayer like Father Nash, he was powerless to convert sinners and move in power. Imagine that. Within a few months, he was dead, and he, like John Hyde, another praying man, had literally prayed himself to death. But he left his legacy. The world would never again see an awakening like that in Rochester. If we refuse to strive in prayer, we should not be surprised at the lack of God's mighty stirrings. It is amazing that we have no problem with people wearing themselves out in sports, for pleasure, work, for money, politics, for power, and programs for charity. But we think it is fanatical to pray this way for souls. Is it any wonder we see so little of God's great working? Daniel Nash would pray until he had to go to bed absolutely sick for weakness and faintness under the pressure and the burden of souls. Finney told of this relationship of intense prayer and successful preaching. Speaking of Nash, he wrote, "I have never seen Christians who would be in agony when the minister was going to the pulpit for fear his mind should be in a cloud, or his heart cold, or he should have no unction, so that the blessing should not come. I have labored with a man of this sort. He would pray until he got an assurance in his mind that God would be with me in preaching. and sometimes he would pray himself ill. I have known the time when he has been in darkness for a season while the people were gathering, and his mind was full of anxiety, and he would go again and again to pray, till finally he would come into a room with a placid face and say, "The Lord has come, and he will be with us." And I do not know that I ever found him mistaken. See, this is called praying through. It's called praying in the Spirit with all perseverance. It's called groaning and travailing in intercessory prayer until the blessing comes. Nash had this great confidence in God who heard and answered prayer. He was not satisfied to stop praying until God answered in mighty power. Praying day and night, great struggling, and weakened health were but prices to be paid that God might move in power. We're talking about the power. We're talking about praying down the power. We're talking about unleashing the power of God through prayer. That's what we need today. We need power. We need the power of God to be manifested greatly as it was in that day. The results were open heavens, glorious power, souls saved, and God glorified. This may well explain why more than 90% of Finney's converts stood true without ever backsliding, and may also explain why less than 10% of today's converts only last a couple of years. We must ask God to help us recover the real spirit of prayer, such as Father Nash and these men possessed. Now, I'm not going to get into it right now, but I think in the next episode, I want to talk about what Finney said and what he taught about how to obtain this spirit of prayer. But for now, I want to focus on this. This is, again, such a lost art, such a lost secret today in learning to pray this way until the blessing comes. I mean, you can pray down. There is a term, again, that I've gotten used to because I heard it in old-time Pentecost, praying down the power. You know, I have heard of men laying hands on people that were demonically possessed, and they would just lay hands on them and pray in the Holy Ghost, pray in other tongues, and claim the victory until the power came and delivered that one. You know, sometimes we get too much into the natural and we get too much into praying with our understanding. I mean, these men would pray for demon-possessed people sometimes for 2 or 3 hours in tongues, all the time just claiming victory, all the time just claiming the power, praying down that power until that demon-possessed one was completely delivered and restored to normal in their minds. And so we have to realize how much power, potential power we have locked up on the inside of us that needs to be prayed out and prayed forth. It's a pregnancy. We can become so pregnant with this power that nothing is impossible. I mean, your children who are wayward and away from God can be brought back to God through this kind of praying that is persistent, that perseveres, that prays through, that goes into groanings and travail, that takes a hold of God until the impossible becomes possible. You can change things. You can move things out of the way. You can move obstacles and hurdles and hindrances out of the way. You can pray into that third heaven. You can pray into victory until entire situations that seem impossible in the natural become possible, and they change through prayer. And it's this kind of prayer. It's not just any kind of prayer. It's this kind of praying. And this is where we need, and again, it's not the crowds, it's not the big public gatherings. I'm not against any of that. But when God lays a burden on people, he doesn't lay the burden on a big crowd of people. He lays burdens on people of prayer. Many times he'll come to the 1, the 2, the 3, the handful of people that are really pressing into God and have developed a sensitivity to the Spirit, and He will put a burden on their hearts to pray out, a burden to carry. It's like they become pregnant. They become pregnant with a burden. They become pregnant with a situation. They become pregnant with lost souls. They become pregnant with a backslidden church. They begin to carry these burdens in prayer, sometimes for days and weeks. And then they begin to pray it out, to birth it through, to bring it to the threshold and the precipice of the manifestation of it. And more of us need to become pregnant with power. We need to become pregnant with the spirit of prayer. And as we look all around us, we can obtain this blessing of having this spirit of prayer until all we can do is begin to fast and groan and travail for the blessing of God and the power of God to come down, to be released. I mean, I don't know about you, but ever since I started doing one of these videos per week at the end of last year, something is changing in me. I mean, if you preach this enough and share this enough and you start pressing in yourself into these deeper realms of prayer, something begins happening to you where you become dissatisfied with anything less than praying these things through and actually seeing the power of God in manifestation. And this is what I want to release today. I want you to put your hand, well, you know what, let's do this next week, because next episode I want to talk about how to obtain this spirit of prayer. Charles Finney called it a spirit of prayer. And he specifically taught about how to obtain a spirit of prayer for lost souls. He said it's the same kind of spirit as sinners feel when they're convicted of their sins. They become miserable inside. They keep thinking about their sins. They keep thinking about coming to God and just surrendering to Him. It's the same thing when Christians carry a spirit of prayer. And you won't obtain this spirit of prayer without thinking continually, meditating continually on the condition of lost souls. Finney encouraged Christians to find scriptures in the Bible that talk about the condition of lost souls and begin to meditate on those scriptures until you obtain the blessing of the spirit of prayer and you begin to be burdened for lost souls. And he equated it to a mother whose child is sick. That child that's maybe really sick is always on the mother's mind. When the child goes to bed, that child is on the mother's mind. If she dreams at night and wakes herself up, she'll immediately think of the child and perhaps think that something has happened to him and perhaps he has died in the middle of the night. That sick child is constantly on her heart. If she hears him screaming or groaning in the other room, she gets up and runs into the room to make sure the child is all right. See, that sick child is her heart. It's her baby. In the same way that she carries that baby, that child in her heart, is the same way we can carry souls or a number of different situations or people in our hearts until we obtain this blessing of the Spirit of God and the Spirit of prayer. So in other words, he's saying you won't obtain the Spirit of prayer without some effort on your part. And again, this is so rare today. You know, we have a lot of public events and public gatherings of prayer, but really a lot of it is just a formality. You know, and we've had enough formal prayers. This is praying really with a burden, something that you can carry something for weeks and months. Carry it in prayer until you come to a place where you're so pregnant, you know the delivery time is so close. Listen, Charles Finney and a small group of men of prayer changed the city of Rochester, New York, until decades, and even I read this about Rochester. 150 years after that revival in 1830 and 1831, it was one of the most charitable cities, kindest cities. One of the best cities to live in was Rochester, New York. So the blessing of that revival lasted almost 2 centuries after the revival actually took place. It's amazing what this kind of prayer can do. And we can't just obtain it with this lackadaisical, nonchalant spirit and asking God for it. We must press into this. We must take upon the conversion of souls in our hearts, the reviving of the church in our hearts, or whatever situation God puts on your heart. We can nurture it. We can water it until it becomes such a burden that we feel like if we don't pray, we're going to bust wide open. See, we can cultivate that spirit of prayer. So power, we must give birth to this power, especially as we approach the coming of the Lord. I believe we're going to see there's been prophecies about it. There's been things that have been said about it. We're going to see the book of Acts and then some. Before Jesus comes, I believe, I've heard it said, hospitals will be emptied of the sick. Christians will be walking in a level of glory that they've never touched before. Jesus is returning for a glorious church, and this glory must be carried and given birth to in the Spirit first, in prayer first. And again, it's not formal prayers, it's not religious prayers, it's this kind of praying where we fast, we groan, we travail, we obtain this blessing until we see what our eyes and our hearts have desired. The great power of God, even as it was in Maria Woodworth Etter's day, that great woman evangelist. She said in her meetings, the power of God could be felt within a 50 to 100 mile radius, where people would fall out, be slain in the Spirit 50 miles away from her meetings. And those people would have to be carried to her meetings and be touched to come out of that state of almost unconsciousness. They become stiff as boards. This is within 50 miles away, and they'd have to be carried to Maria Woodworth, her meetings where she was, and they would have to be touched to be released from that condition they were in. Such was the great manifestation of the power of God. Where is that power today? We're going to see it around the globe, I believe, before Jesus comes. But it has to start with this desire and this appetite and this burden to obtain the spirit of prayer, where we're willing to lock ourselves up sometimes for hours and days and weeks until the blessing is obtained, until we see the change, until we see the manifest presence of God, not only in our location where we are, in our proximity, but where we see it go out even miles away, that presence can be felt and sinners can be changed. So anyway, that's what was on my heart today. Thanks for listening. Again, all these videos are transferred to our YouTube channel, Holy Fire Ministries. The other 20, this is the 24th episode, are on there. You can also go to our website, holy-fire.org, and get books like this that talk about prayer and the power of prayer. Get books like this on tongues, the elevation of a mystery. We don't have power today. Let me tell you something very plain. We don't have this kind of power that I talked about today because we don't pray in tongues long enough. I heard Dad Hagin say that years ago, and I never forgot it. It's so simple. Why don't we have this kind of power manifested today? Because we don't pray in tongues long enough. We give up. We don't persevere. Praying in the Spirit and watching thereunto with all perseverance, with all, not halfway, not a little way, that all perseverance. In other words, we pray through until we know we have obtained the blessing. Again, this is a lost art today that needs to be restored in the church. If you'll ask God for it and press into it, I am sure that God will give us this blessing of the spirit of prayer so we can pray and persevere and pray these things out. We can't persevere in the flesh. It's not through efforts in the flesh. Only by obtaining the spirit of prayer can we pray at length, and we can persevere until the blessing comes. Thank you for tuning in. We love you. We hope these episodes are a blessing to you, and we hope you subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of these. I do one a week until the end of the year. So listen and watch these and ask God. Press into the spirit of prayer until you obtain the blessing. All right. God bless you. Thank you for tuning in.